Alright, it's about 5:30 in the morning and there's a storm brewing outside, so I figured what better time to just go ahead and shoot this video. Why not? So, continuing our 7 days of remakes, as far as Versus goes, now we have these two. The Poseidon Adventure from 1972 and Poseidon from 2006. I can never remember if it's 72 or 79, I'm pretty sure it's 72. So, now that we have that out of the way, we do have two big names attached to these, and that does not involve the cast, despite the fact that the cast do have... Poseidon Adventure especially has a very long list of very recognizable names with it. But the ones that are kind of above the title, I guess you could say, in two different jobs, where with the Poseidon Adventure, it is the producer, who is Irwin Allen, who... You know, you often hear the phrase, or the title, Master of Disaster, and you typically think of something negative, but yeah, there actually was somebody in the movie industry at some point that had that title in a very positive light, basically being the godfather of that whole genre. And over here, the director of Poseidon, the remake from 2006, is Wolfgang Peterson, and since I'm shooting these a bit in advance, we, just lost Wolfgang Peterson as I am shooting this, who, of course, did a number of things, but the one you'll probably see mentioned the most is Das Boot, which is really funny because you go in 2006 and you hear that the director of Das Boot is making a Poseidon Adventure remake. You probably think, okay, that's there's very high expectations. So I guess we will just try to decide if those expectations were met, not just based on that, but also based on the original movie as well, and we'll kind of jump back and forth a little bit. But I guess the first thing I want to point out is something that I've said many times before, and that is, and as far as looking at the disaster movie as a genre, while it does have a lot of acclaim around it, and they've made so many famous movies in this genre, like massive hits, there is one criticism from the critical world that these movies tend to get, and that is the fact that they are more or less very large-scale, naturally based slasher movies, where we introduce a whole array of characters, and then as the movie goes on, these characters will die in potentially horrific ways as we go on until the end. And there's even the point where on the paper inside the original movie here, the tagline, it literally shows all the cast members, and the tagline is, "Who will survive?" It's basically a slasher movie, which you'll see a lot in other disaster movies. But I remember even the Towering Inferno, with another Irwin Allen production, with its reputation, still kind of had this critical backlash where it was the idea was just seeing how they could kill the characters in different ways. But I've always said that I actually kind of like that about the disaster movie. It gives it this really sort of unexpected quality when you look at it, where you see something that's this large scale and this massive a production and so effects heavy, and the fact that this is kind of what your attachment to the characters are as you go, where you're not quite sure which ones are going to make it out to the other side. I find that to be a really fascinating thing in the setup of these types of movies, as opposed to just, a regular slasher movie where people are being off by another person or entity or whatever. And the fact that this is nature doing that work. So, yeah, I've always been kind of fascinated by that thing. I also think it's very funny that the Poseidon Adventure comes off as a very dark and bleak movie to have the word adventure in the title. It could potentially give the wrong idea. But there's even a line at the beginning with Mrs. Rogo where she's sick and the doctor comes in, and they're talking about, oh, nobody's dying, and she says, "Who's not dying?" And it's that's a really good question, Mrs. Rogo. By the end of this movie, we're not sure who's going to die and who's not going to die, so it's almost like it was foreshadowing kind of early, not just introducing the characters, but also a lot of potential fates. I think the other interesting thing that the remake decided not to go down, that this one does, and I think it makes a lot more sense for it to be this, I guess where research was harder to do at the time, they did this really interesting thing. They did the Fargo thing. where it opens with opening text, and it doesn't imply that it's a true story the way like something like Fargo did, but when you see text like that at the beginning, where it works just the way it does, where it kind of gives you hints of what happened, and then saying like this is the story of what happened or whatever. I think, especially at the time in the 70s, and maybe even today, the people that don't know that eventually find this movie are under the impression it was a true story because of this opening text. And what I think is great about that also is the idea of giving it this really real feel, where it feels like something that could happen. Especially when you look at something like the Titanic or something, and how it's almost like this sort of, it almost comes off like this sort of this fictional telling of that specifically, but obviously there's a lot of different factors here. But I do find it believable that a lot of audiences would have come into this, especially at the time, thinking, "Oh, this really happened." And if I remember correctly, it's based on a book, which I have not read, but I am very interested to know how it like reads. So I'd like to find that eventually. But yeah, so as you would expect out of these movies, both of them begin with us kind of getting introduced to the characters, and most notably the famous faces that are attached to them. Maybe less so than the characters in many cases, but there's still some interesting relationships here and there. I would say one of the most interesting relationships we get pre the disaster is the relationship between Ernest Borgnine and his wife, Mrs. Rogo, who are, we learn through context clues as they get closer and then basically spelled out, that these two are a cop and a prostitute, and the way that they met was she kept getting arrested by him. And it's like, that's interesting, by the way. Just right off the bat, you're not going to find a character's origin story as interesting as that in the remake. None of them have that interesting of a backstory. That's about as good as it gets. As far as, I mean, there's also a major character in this, but before we go to him, I want to come over here to talk about what Richard Dreyfuss is bringing to the table. Because, to my understanding, this was a movie that Richard Dreyfuss has said that he did. This was the movie that put his kid through college, and that's the only reason he did it. And I've mentioned before how Richard Dreyfuss is one of my favorite actors, and I think this movie can actually be a true testament, one of the true testaments to why I feel that way about him, because if what you see Richard Dreyfuss doing in Poseidon is essentially him phoning it in, or as close to phoning it in as he will get, then he's obviously one of the greatest ever. Because there's actually something here. He feels like he's got like the most heart in the movie, and it feels the whole time like he's giving it 100%. Like even if he isn't on the inside, it's coming through on the screen, and I think that says a lot. And I guess the most comparable character to him with the original kind of feels like the Red Buttons character. It's clear that they weren't kind of trying to do exact taking characters and doing this. Like, you'll see different pieces of, like how when we first see Red Buttons in the original movie, he's, jogging around the ship, and that's our first shot of Josh Lucas in this one, who's kind of supposed to be kind of our central protagonist here, but I don't know. But the other thing that came to mind was the fact that they go into the fact that Dreyfuss's character is gay, which I'd kind of wondered if the idea was that Red Buttons' character might be, but they couldn't quite say that in 72, because they really devote a lot of time to the fact that his character doesn't have a wife. Like, they really focus on that, though he does sort of believably tell us it's because of his work, and he's like, never open a haberdashery, stuff like that. But the thing that I love about this, and this introduction of this character, is what it says about what goes on in this, but I do also think that they opened up so much with this. Like, the character was too good that the movie ends up suffering for it because the movie can't commit to what other doors it opens up. Because there should be a whole lot of survivor's guilt going on with the Dreyfuss character that I find very interesting. There's one thing we'll get into later that involves an actual death, But the first thing here is to think about the fact that this was a guy that had basically reached his end point and was going to commit suicide when this movie starts. It's really, really brewing now. Definitely picked the perfect time to do this. Hopefully you can still hear me. So he's about to commit suicide as the wave is coming, and then that's what gets him off the ledge and back in and start to warn people. And it's like, you see the mass death that happens here with all the characters in this movie, in the remake, and this is a character whose life was saved by this event. Because he was about to take it himself, and then he ends up being one of the survivors. After the disaster itself is what stopped him from ending his own life. That is way deeper than the rest of this movie is willing to go, as far as like this character goes, and the aftermath of that. But I mean, I guess you could also say there's only so much they can do. But another problem is that you will not find any other character in the remake that has that interesting of a setup. So that's I said the peak of that was Bordine and his wife. The exception, of course, being what Dreyfuss has going on here. But as far as introducing other characters, it does feel like a lot of them are just kind of here as side characters. There's more that make an impact in the original. Another one I really wanted to go into, the one that I kind of sidestepped, was Hackman, obviously. And the idea that what's interesting about Hackman's character is he actually does something that the remake never really does, to my knowledge, which is sets up a character's backstory in a way that it feels like it's kind of a theme throughout the whole movie. Because it could just seem like it's a random choice to have Hackman playing a preacher, and then he's kind of... There's the other preacher there, but then there's the kind of clashing that's going on there a little bit. But then when you look at what's going on here with the way this movie brings religion into it, where it's like, and this is also a case where I guess it depends on what the viewer reads into it. So I'm not necessarily stating anything I say right now as actual fact, but I will just say that I think after you get that introduction, it seems to become a theme throughout the movie, where we obviously reach this point where, and as we've seen in real life, if disaster should strike, it seems like the first thing people are going to do is divide, and you get this side, or it's this side, and there's no in between. You have to either be this thing, or following this thing, or following that thing. And it's interesting how religion kind of starts to play a part in this, where it's like, the movie seems to introduce how fine the line is between having faith and just sort of blindly following. Without really having your own thought or having your own belief, and just kind of going in that direction. And so we do have these moments where there's the clear opening to this is potentially the only way we're going to live, or if you follow this person. And there's always one person at the head of each group. And this goes this way for this big sort of nearly half an hour sequence between the wave hitting and then them getting up to the next level. And by the way, I love the fact that sequence is so long, because it doesn't feel like it at all. And it goes into like sort of a... Instead of dealing with action sequences, it feels like the first movie deals more in problem solving than anything else. And I feel like that's a big example of that. But then once they get broken up in their places, you start to see these followings that happen when they... later in the movie, when they come across that other group that they're surprised to still see alive, I feel like it's not exactly an accident that when we get that first shot of them, like from a distance, walking down the perpendicular hallway, they look like zombies. And they're just sort of following the other guy. And it's like, oh, we believe it's this way, so that's the absolute truth. And Hackman has to say, no, it's this way. But then there's the argument of, is that the absolute truth or not? And then the crossroads they come to where it's like, well, we'll try one out, and if it doesn't work out, it might cost the life of one of us, but at least we'll know. And that's a whole nice dynamic that doesn't really come through in the remake. We do have the stuff in the remake where, they go their separate ways, and there's the people that live and the people that die. But it's, like I said, I feel like blatant as that might sound, I actually feel like we're not really beaten over the head with it in the original movie. Like, you could just watch the original movie completely on a surface level, and not go into it that much, and the characters will still ring true in some way. But there are cases also where there's a lot of characters. So take for instance the way the music is used at the parties, where we have the original movie where we have the what would eventually be the Oscar-winning song, which is really funny that the waiter is like hating on the song as we introduced to Roddy McDowall and everything, and then we have Nani's brother who's in there, who I feel like has no dialogue that I remember, but does still end up playing a very crucial part in this as far as his death and how it affects her. Compare that to, hey, Fergie's in this. Which seems to pretty much be the only thing that the remake is interested in as far as this portion goes. There is that weird moment where Andre Braugher, who's playing the captain, and her kind of come together as we start to get the mass death scene. And I don't really know what's going on there between the two of them. That I don't remember it hinting at them having any sort of history. I feel like he just kind of introduces her on stage, and then the song is just, like I said, this movie's song won an Oscar. This one just kind of feels like, hey, let's put Fergie in this. And then it feels like, oh, we've got Fergie now. We need to give her just a little bit more screen time. So let's have her have this weird close interaction with the captain that really has no dialogue, and then they die together. Like it's some big emotional thing. I don't know. Because I remember correctly, we don't even see Leslie Nielsen die in this when he plays the captain in this. He just kind of disappears from the movie, and we assume that he's dead. I remember seeing him amongst the bodies, but there's a lot of bodies there. But yeah, so I feel like that's pretty much where we are with the characters. There is the dynamic of like the child characters. Like we have the brother and sister in this, and in this it's a mother and a son. The mother in this is Jacinda Barrett, who, honestly, I just keep forgetting is in this movie. That's how kind of useless this character is. But there's also the main thing going on here, where we have Kurt Russell's the dad, and Emmy Rossum's the daughter, and she has the boyfriend that he doesn't approve of, but they want to, go on and be married or whatever. Old, boring shit we've seen over and over again that is not remotely interesting whatsoever. But I think that's what's even less interesting than that is Josh Lucas's character in this movie has to be one of the dullest lead characters in a movie like this that I can think of. He's because I was talking about the problem solving being such a great factor of the original movie, and of course you have to have that obstacle where Josh Lucas is one of those guys that's like, I work alone. It's like, this fucking guy, and I love that he's so unmemorable. At one point he's playing Kurt Russell and Kevin Dillon are all, gambling together, and then later on, Kevin Dillon obviously knows Kurt Russell because Kurt Russell used to be the mayor or whatever, and he sees Josh Lucas, and I believe the actual line is, "Oh, hey, it's the other guy." So it's like the movie knows it has a shitty protagonist, but we just kind of have to run with it, because this one's going to be more of, I guess, an action-y sort of movie as we go on, and that's basically setting that up. So, with all that said, I don't know how much more character-based stuff we're going to have. I do want to talk about somebody else, the person that got an Oscar nomination for the Poseidon Adventure, as we go on also. But in the meantime, I guess what we should talk about right now is the disaster itself and how it's portrayed, because it obviously is portrayed in two particularly different ways. Now, the interior stuff is actually pretty similar. Like, you watch the disaster happen in 1972, and it honestly looks just as good as the interior stuff of the disaster happening in 2006, which is pretty amazing. I feel like the only thing of flair that the remake really added was that shot of the pool being thrown out with everybody in it is pretty wild. But everything else on the interior feels like it was pretty much accomplished the same way, which looks really great. The difference, though, is that we do get exterior shots of the ship turning over in the original, but they're very brief and quick, and we don't get that many of them. Whereas, obviously, in CGI land, we're going to get about half interior shots, half outside stuff of the ship's destruction and turning over and all that stuff. And I actually do much prefer, not just because of the CGI, but I do much prefer staying in the interior as much as we can as we do in the original, because it feels like it puts us much more in the perspective of the characters, where it's like, and as you see the sets start to turn and go the other way, you kind of have that, you can put yourself in the mindset enough of those characters that are like, what the hell is happening, like what is going on right now. And with the less exterior shots you get of the boat turning over, the more it's like disorienting in the way the characters would be. That's really appealing. So that's, yeah, but like I said, it's very impressive that it actually, when we're actually seeing the sets turning, that it looks more or less the same in each movie, and they're decades apart. That says so much about the 72 movie and how much they pulled that off. So I really love that. Now, the next thing I do want to talk about at length, which is something we're going to talk about some stuff I was alluding to earlier, is the way I talked about how these movies are essentially slasher movies and we're introduced to all the characters. We don't know who's going to die or not. The way these movies approach death is going to be very important to their tones and just kind of in general how the movies turn out. So let's take a look at this. What I really love about the original is how much it focuses on the idea of processing death, making it this very human emotion. Like, characters don't just get offed and then it just goes. First off, they both do share that scene of the survivors getting out, and then you just hear the screaming of everybody else as everybody drowns in mass. So they both pull that off, but then as far as individual characters and the way, even more importantly, how other characters react, which is something that the original really focused on. And what I love about it and what makes the characters feel really human is that you'll notice that all the characters that experience death close to them in the original movie all seem to process death in a different way. Like, take for instance, Rosen, the Jack Albertson character, the husband of Shelley Winters. When she dies, it's this very sort of gradual thing where, like, he knows, but he doesn't want it to be true. Where they go back up and Borgnine says, you know, oh, she got through, and it's kind of setting in like, but something went wrong. And then it's like, it's like, even though Borgnine keeps trying to push it, it's like, just the way you're wording that, there's something wrong, and you can feel it building, you can feel the realization, and it's kind of setting in. And then when he goes in and then gets to her, and then there's a moment where he just kind of, compared to everybody else, very slowly breaks down, and just kind of lets the whole new reality set in, then having that driving force of having the necklace to take to their grandchildren. And there's like, you can see the whole process from when he first heard, like, oh, she got through, and he wasn't saying that she was alive, which Albertson plays so well. And then you've got what Nani's got going on with her brother, where she's in denial kind of the whole time, where she's kind of in denial when she's in denial when she's right there next to his body, and he's clearly not breathing, he's clearly not alive, and Redbuds kind of has to help her through this. And then as the movie goes on, she's still like struggling with past tense and present tense. And then we eventually late get in that moment where it's like she finally comes to terms with the fact that, oh shit, it's real. Like, he's just not here now. And then there's that whole progress. And then we have Rogo watching his wife fall into the flames at the very end, right when they're this close to safety. She falls off and dies. And we've seen, you know, with Nani it took practically the whole movie. With Rosen we kind of watched it slowly come to realization. With Rogo it's just instantaneous. Like, it's just 1 second she's alive, the next second she's dead, and his mind just immediately goes there. And it's a full-on gigantic Ernest Borgnine outburst. And I love the way the movie portrays all of those different grievances differently. Ways of grieving. And as far as the 2006 movie, this is where I can kind of see where it was, you could see it criticized for the way it just heartlessly kills off its characters. The first thing, obviously, there's a lot of characters that die in the remake in elaborate ways. But obviously, the most glaring one that we have to talk about is Freddy Rodriguez playing Valentine. The guy who was just a waiter who brought on a stowaway so that she could get back to her brother. That was his only crime. And you talk about these movies, like disaster movies or adventure movies, whatever you want to call them, where movies have been criticized before about giving characters completely unnecessarily excessive deaths that they did not deserve. You hear a lot about it with the babysitter, whoever she was, in Jurassic World, having that really elaborate death that she in no way deserved. You hear a lot about Tom McCarthy in 2012 getting pulled into getting ground up or whatever happened to him in a way that he didn't deserve at all. But I feel like I never hear about, I don't know if it's just because this movie's so forgotten at this point or not, but I feel like just right along at that conversation, if not at the top of that conversation, should be Valentine here, helping people across this elevator shaft that's on fire at the bottom. People will obviously fall to their death. And then it gets to the point to where Richard Dreyfuss is the last one. And he's like, you go first. I'll help you up, you go first. So he, in the goodness of his soul, he's going to help this guy survive. And then, of course, there is a collapse, and he has to hold on to Richard Dreyfuss's ankle to survive, in hopes that they'll both be pulled up. And that's when Josh Lucas, our protagonist of protagonists, gets the idea of, yeah, you're both going to drop if you don't make a choice here. So, kick him off. Doesn't matter that he just helped you. If you don't want to go, he's got to go. And so, and yeah, you can't put that against Dreyfuss's character. That's a whole other thing I was going to go into about the survivor's guilt. And the fact that the movie never really... You would think that this is another thing that would just haunt this Dreyfuss character, and it's definitely something as an actor he could pull off. But the movie puts him in these dire situations, and then there's never really much of an emotional payoff with him. You would think this would eat away the Dreyfuss character for the rest of the movie. On top of the fact that all these other characters died when he would have died, and yet this whole thing saved him. But I digress, so that we can talk about the fact that Valentine plunges to his death. That's not enough. Because you could compare it to, because they're both waiters, you can compare it to Roddy McDowall in the original movie, where he falls into the water, Roga goes after him, and then we just kind of hear an explosion, and we see the water go up, and then only Roga comes back up, and we know what happened. No. We're not going to be that nice to Valentine. He's going to have to plunge to his death, which would have killed him anyway, okay, because it's an elevator shaft. But he has to be impaled first, okay, then crushed to death by the flaming elevator, then an explosion has to happen. And it's at this point I can see, okay, I get where the criticisms come from about the heartless way disaster movies can treat their characters like a slasher movie. Because as it goes on, we have Kevin Dillon, who is eventually crushed to death and then also plunges afterwards. But here, I can't really think of anybody like this in the original movie. Here, they clearly set up Kevin Dillon as an unlikable character, so that it's I guess, supposed to be satisfying for the audience that he dies in such an elaborate, brutal way. That's another thing you kind of see in slasher movies, where you see innocent characters get slaughtered, but you also see characters that are built up for you to hate, so that it's, cathartic? When they die horribly? I don't know, but that's clearly what Kevin Dillon's purpose is here. It's a little weird. The only time they really seem to go into it, that they try to bring something to a death, in the way that they bring to Shelley Winters' death scene in the original, that's this really big emotional moment, is Elena's death here. Where it's another case like the Shelley Winters character, where she had unfinished business had she gotten out of this. But of course, while Jack Albertson was here to carry that on, we don't really have another character here. So it's this really, really tragic thing, and Dreyfuss kind of had, started to get a connection to her, so there was some... So he gets the Jack Albertson moment of mourning. It's like he's mourning her, but he's not mourning Valentine or, everybody that died while he lives. And I don't know, but he got really attached to Elena, so and we have to have the Shelley Winters scene for some sort of emotional payoff here. So that's what they try, I guess. If there is one death that actually does kind of closely earn that impact, it would obviously be the Kurt Russell scene where he gets to save everybody and do that last act of valiance as he knowingly dies. And there is something to this scene with the way they, because this is a case where I feel like the more hard to watch the scene is, the more like you can appreciate this sort of real feel that it has to it watching this person die. And it's like watching Kurt Russell, not just like, it could have easily just been him drowning, you know, like he pushes a button and then he just starts to float. But watching him struggle against death, like he knows death is coming, but we actually like almost see him like trying to fight it, even knowing it's a lost cause. And there's moments in there like that kind of stick out. Like when I saw this in theaters in 2006, that was the scene that always kind of stuck in my head more. That and Valentine's Day were the ones that really stuck out to me. But that's pretty much what we have here as far as the death goes. But now that did want to bring me back to Shelley Winters, who I haven't talked about yet, because like I said, she's the one that got an Oscar nomination for this. And the reason I want to talk about her so individually is because I can understand. A lot of people think it's a really weird nomination. And it's like, did she get it on her own name value? And it's like, how did this happen? But there is definitely something to this character that I've never really felt like it was a nomination that was like, how did that happen? I do think she really brings something to the character. First and foremost, when I think of Shelley Winters' characters, typically I think of the characters she played that are very no-nonsense and kind of take no shit. So it is kind of jarring to see her in this. Kind of jarring in a good way as far as looking at her as an actress. To watch her in this and see the verbal abuse that she takes. And just kind of lets it, like it clearly hurts, but she kind of lets it bounce off her because she realizes the dire situation that they're in. Like how Mrs. Roger like calls her fat ass at one point. And it's like you can see the pain, but she also knows that there's like as far as it being stuck in this situation where she's the one that seems the most scared. Like there's children here, but she's the one that comes off the most scared. But not even in this really like, you know, annoying shrill way that you might expect from a character like this. But in this way to where it's like she's the most scared, but she's still always pushing through. Like it makes perfect sense to me that she's the one that has the big heroic moment before her death. That's like the one big like underwater sequence we actually get in this, which kind of adds even more impact to that because we get a shitload of underwater scenes and people, you know, moving around underwater and doing action underwater in the remake, and it starts to grow dull and repetitive pretty quickly, despite the fact that it's always in your mind like what the actors were going through, like to actually be submerged and for however long they were shooting this. But it's like it's all you need is one big sequence. And you have not just the big special effects sequence where it's an actor that's actually submerged, but also the emotional impact that this scene has. And the whole turnaround where it's not just her having a heroic moment, but she's saving Hackman in the process. Also, the person that's like the Josh Lucas of the movie, the one that's supposed to be the big hero. And it's like, and I love the way they were also able to give Hackman vulnerabilities like that. They don't seem to really want to give Josh Lucas had to always be Mr. Heroic throughout this pretty much. And it's like, and the only reason that Kurt Russell got the big dying moment was it just feels like the character beat into it. Like the character had to race him to it practically. That and the boyfriend, but that's the whole thing. And that's the thing also about the Winters character is her interactions with everybody else. Like her interaction with the kid, where the kid is like, you know, he mentioned like the 600-pound fish or something, and he was concerned that she might have taken it the wrong way and like taken it as a slight against her, and they have that little interaction. And it does feel like this really real moment, despite the fact that there's things that they need to be doing instead, like climbing the ladder. And that works so much better. And I feel like it's because of what she brought to that character that that scene has that real feel to it, her and the kid. Whereas when you look at the stuff like when we're in the middle of a dire circumstance here, and Kurt Russell and the boyfriend are doing that, the father-boyfriend thing, the father-boyfriend bonding thing, and it's like, we just don't need this right now. Not only because we've just seen, not only because of what's going on here in general, but because we've just seen this shit so many times. Like, who cares? So that's the problem with that. I do think a lot of it may have to do with the fact that the 2006 movie makes a better theatrical experience. Because I remember loving this when I saw it in the theater in 2006. I also would have been like 15 or 16 at the time. But it's but still there. And I wasn't. I had seen this one, or at least parts of this one, by 2006. But it was pretty vague at the time. So I was like really, really into this one when it first came out. So I didn't really have much of a comparison as far as like how well this one handles its characters and all those real moments. So I talked about the ladder scene, and there's also the moment where Red Buttons is helping Nani throughout it, and this is another one of those scenes also. And there's the scene later where it's like, you know, if you're not getting out, then I'm not getting out, and stuff like that. You know, stuff that we have seen before, but like how this cast in particular really brought it to life in a way that made it feel like these were real characters in this real situation, which adds to the suspense of it as much as the emotion, which is really important. Like I said, here we're mostly getting, you know, cliche character moments. There is like a big moment of suspense here where they have to have Jimmy Bennett go up and unscrew the gate because he's the only one small enough, and it's like the water's rising and Dreyfus is stuck and Elena's starting to panic, and it's like the way that builds is pretty well done. But like I said, that's like one sequence amid a lot of really repetitive sequences of going through water and, you know, going through dark shafts or whatever, and it's like the as much as all the effects that were put into this, it does feel, and from a director that is so capable of stuff like this, so capable of suspense, and these type of big productions. Like I said, it's poor timing to do this right after we lost him, because he contributed so much to movies in such a big way, and this is the first movie I talk about afterwards. It doesn't quite do him justice. There's a lot of like, as far as the scale of the movie and how the effects are really well done, and there is some really good action and really good suspense in it, there's also a lot that kind of counter that sort of aren't as suspenseful, aren't as exciting, aren't as well executed. And yeah, and like I said, it feels like there's some stuff missing. Like, all the characters here, it feels like every emotion gets hit. Like, what I really admire about the original movie, that is not something you'll see in this, is when I talk about, like, doing emotional payoffs, like with how the Dreyfus character feels like he should have so many emotional payoffs, but they just kind of make him go through something and then they move along. I guess what you could say, because you could say, what are you looking for? Because they're in this situation, they have to keep moving. Well, first off, we get plenty of grieving scenes that feel real enough, but also feel like the clock is ticking in this one. But the moment that really stands out is the final moment right before during the rescue in the original movie, which is they reach the saving grace. Like, in this one you get the really awesome shot of the flare like turning into the helicopter as they come in and they're saved, and it's this great feeling, sure. This one does have a really good climax too, like the whole thing of Kurt Russell's sacrifice and the engines and all that. It's a great climax that takes us to a great transition with the flare into the helicopter and then everybody's being saved. But what it doesn't have is this amazing moment where it's being cut through, the people are coming in to rescue them. It's over. The disaster is over. They have survived. And yet there's a total sort of melancholy, a total sadness, where as the wall is being cut through and they're waiting to be rescued, it's clear they're taking a moment to stop, and they're thinking about, like, this should be a jovial moment, this should be a moment of triumph. And that's when it sets in all the people that aren't here for this, all the people that have been lost along the way. Loved ones, strangers, people they met while they were here, whatever it may be, they are the only ones left, and that's the feeling that sets in. That's the first feeling that sets in as they're being rescued. And and I feel like it's risky, too, for a movie like this that was going to be such a big production and, you know, gather so many crowds, to make that the final focus instead of triumph, is it's kind of crazy in retrospect that they went that way, but it works so well. And it's so, like, there's a bittersweetness, sure, but it's also just kind of devastating. And I really, really love that they really did not shy away from that kind of thing in this, which I love. Which, like I said, just further shows how having adventure in the title feels like such a misdirect. But yeah, so that's pretty much how I feel about these, I think. So clearly, on an emotional standpoint, and kind of the way that everything is held up, like effects wise, this one still really stands out to me. Whereas this one has some, great moments in it and great, set pieces in it or whatever. And it's very entertaining, for sure. I don't want to take that away from it. But it's where you have a lot of the practical stuff in this. 2006 CGI is not going to be holding up as well, and that kind of shows. But like I said, like the initial disaster sequence is great in both of them for sure. But like I said though, the more they both accomplish it in such similar fashions, it almost feels like it highlights this one even more every time you talk about how good the interior of the disaster is in this one. So it just seems like everything you could say about this kind of props up the original, just inherently. But there's still something worthwhile here. I will admit, before a recent rewatch, I had not seen this one in a very long time. So take that for what you will as far as it having that kind of factor to be able to come back to it. But there is still an entertaining factor here, and there's some stuff that I had kind of forgotten about it. But I mainly had remembered it from seeing it in the theater, which was really great when it was like really big. So there's that. But I just feel like the original accomplishes so much more on pretty much all fronts, especially on the emotional front and the character front. So I didn't even mention Hackman's sacrifice scene, which is really big when he is basically facing off against God once and for all. So I feel like pretty much just about everything is exceeded as far as the original goes, but I don't really have too much. It might sound like I have some frustrations with the 2006 movie, but I don't have real serious beef with it or anything. So I think now that we've reached the end, the storm has finally blown over. So, and we've lived, much like our survivors here. So it sounded a little intense for a little bit, but I think we were through it. So I can leave this at this. So the next thing is we're going back and forth here with the William Hurt thing and the remake thing. So we'll just continue to do that. Since I'm shooting these all out of order and in advance, I'm not quite sure which one I have scheduled to be next, but yeah. You're getting another William Hurt and then another remake versus, and then we'll be doing that until our 7 days for each are up, and then we'll go into something else. So until whatever the next thing is, I think that's it.